The roll call started at the 9th hour, same as always. Vrethna ran her finger down the list. 47 species, 47 seats. She had done this so many times the names moved through her mouth like water. Keth, Suvari, Rel, Dramosi, Velhari, Terran. She looked up. The Terran seat was empty. Not late. Not vacant in the way a delegate sometimes stepped out for a moment and left a jacket on the chair to prove they existed. Empty, in a different way. A clean way. No jacket. No personal terminal. No coffee cup, and there was always a coffee cup. In 230 years of Terran membership, there had always been a coffee cup in that seat. She logged it as an anomaly and moved on. 46 species were present. Quorum held. The session proceeded. 3 hours later, the Terran diplomatic relay went dark. Not one relay. All of them. 32 worlds. Every embassy, every liaison office, every communications post. Gone in the same 10-minute window. Like someone had walked down a very long corridor, turning off lights one by one, and then closed the door at the end. No emergency signal. No forwarding address. No automated message explaining a technical issue. Vrethna stared at the map on her screen. 32 dark points where there had been light. She called the Terran embassy on the capital world. The line connected. Rang. 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 Nobody picked up. She sent a formal inquiry through diplomatic channels. The message was delivered. The read receipt never came. She pulled the Terran seat record from the archive 230 years of attendance logs, session notes, submitted motions, filed reports. The file was enormous. Humans had been busy members. Active members. The kind that submitted comments on procedural drafts at 2 in the morning and flagged formatting errors and resolutions that nobody else had bothered to read closely enough to catch. She scrolled to the end of the file. The last entry was from 14 days ago. A routine attendance confirmation, submitted on time, correctly formatted. The second to last entry was also routine. So was the third. Right up to the very end, they had been doing their paperwork correctly, and then they had simply stopped. Vrethna spent the next hour looking for the correct form to file for a full civilizational withdrawal from the Council. There were forms for individual delegate absences, forms for emergency diplomatic suspension, forms for temporary membership freeze due to internal political instability. There was no form for what this was. She checked the administrative codex, the thick procedural document that governed Council operations, the one that had been written and revised and maintained for the last 140 years by successive generations of human bureaucrats, who apparently found that sort of thing satisfying. The codex did not cover this scenario. Of course it didn't. The people who wrote it had never imagined they'd be the ones to leave. Vrethna created a new form. She titled it Unilateral Membership Cessation, Civilizational Scale. She filed it with her own office, because there was nobody else to file it with. Then she sat back and looked at the empty seat across the chamber floor. It was, she realized, slightly scuffed on the left armrest. She had never noticed that before. Thessaly Orn was 40 cycles old, which made her the youngest aide on the Council Secretariat, and therefore the one who got the tasks nobody else wanted. Today's unwanted task was cross-referencing the attendance logs against the diplomatic communication records to find out if the Terran absence had any pattern behind it. She expected to spend an hour on it. She spent 6. The pattern was not hard to find. It was so obvious, once she looked, that she sat very still for a moment after she found it. The way you go still when you realize you've been mispronouncing a word your entire life. Terran delegates had been showing up less for 10 years. Not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger any alert. 1 delegate where there used to be 3. 2 votes skipped out of 10. Motions submitted but no follow-up when they were tabled. Like someone slowly, carefully, quietly reducing a dependency. Like someone weaning the Council off a habit it didn't know it had. She pulled the records of which motions they had submitted over the last decade. How many had passed? How many had been tabled? How many had been ignored outright? She made a column for each category. The tabled column was very long. The ignored column was longer. She looked at the past column for a while. It was not empty, but most of what was there was small. Procedural things. Administrative corrections. The kind of work that kept the machine running, and that nobody celebrated because machines were supposed to run. The big things, the risk flags, the structural proposals, the early warnings about supply chain fragility, and medical database maintenance and conflict escalation models that were running on outdated parameters. Those were in the other columns. All of them. Every single one. Thessaly printed the report. Looked at it. Put it in a folder. She wasn't sure who to give it to. She wasn't sure anyone would want it. By the end of the first week, the confusion had moved from strange to alarming. The council convened a special session. 46 species in their seats. 1 seat empty and clean. Everyone speaking with the careful, measured tone that meant they were more worried than they wanted to show. The Keth senior delegate said it was almost certainly a political maneuver. Humans were known for being indirect. This was probably a negotiation tactic. They would resurface with demands shortly. The Suvari delegate agreed. Every species had its methods. This was the human method. They would wait it out. The Rel delegate said nothing. The Rel rarely said anything in open session that they hadn't already said in private first. Vrethna listened to all of them and looked at the empty seat. 230 years. She had been council secretary for 19 of those years. Before that, she had been an aide, like Thessaly. She had walked past that seat thousands of times. She had nodded at the humans who sat in it, had exchanged the brief professional courtesies of people who work in the same building, had processed their paperwork and forwarded their communications, and occasionally eaten lunch near them in the common hall. She had never, she realized, sat down and actually talked to any of them. Not really. Not in the way where you learn something about a person. It hadn't seemed necessary. They were always there. They were always going to be there. She thought about what it meant 230 years of always being there, and then one day deciding not to be, and filing no complaint, sending no warning, making no dramatic exit, just turning off the lights and closing the door. The session ended without a resolution. Literally no resolution was passed because no one could agree on what to resolve. Vrethna noted the outcome in the official record as ongoing assessment, pending further information. She walked back to her office past the empty seat. The faint smell of coffee was still there. Probably her imagination. She kept walking. Thessaly Orn stayed late that night. She had started a document. She was calling it the dependency audit because it needed a name, and that name was honest. She was listing every council system, every operational function, every piece of infrastructure and administrative process that had a Terran origin or a Terran maintainer or a Terran hand somewhere in its history. She had been working for 4 hours. She was on page 9. She was not close to done. She refilled her water, rolled her shoulders, and kept going. The first real crack appeared on day 11. A Keth cargo ship running standard transit between the Marin system and the outer trade hubs input its route and got nothing back. Not an error message, not a reroute suggestion, just silence where the navigation response should have been. The pilot tried again. Silence. She flagged it to her dispatcher. The dispatcher flagged it to the Regional Transit Authority. The Regional Transit Authority spent 2 days running diagnostics before someone finally dug into the system architecture far enough to find the problem. The routing logic, the mathematical framework that calculated safe, efficient, faster-than-light paths across 30% of the Council's primary trade corridors had been written by a human team 60 years ago. It had been updated, patched, and maintained by human contractors ever since. The contracts had been renewed automatically every 3 years because the system worked and nobody thought to look at who was keeping it working. The last contract renewal had not gone through. Not because anyone canceled it, because the Terran contractor company that held it had closed quietly 8 months ago, and the renewal request had been sitting in a pending queue, and nobody had followed up because the system was still functioning on its existing parameters, and nobody had imagined that existing parameters had an expiry. The parameters expired on day 9 of the human absence. It took 2 more days for the failure to become visible, like a bridge with a cracked support beam fine until the weight of a truck, and then not fine at all. The Keth called an emergency session. The council convened. The Keth delegate explained the problem in precise and agitated terms. Several other delegates asked questions that demonstrated they did not fully understand what faster-than-light routing math was or how it functioned. The session lasted 4 hours. Nobody in the room knew how to fix it. Thessaly Orn, sitting in the back taking notes, added the routing network to her audit. The document was now 31 pages long. The Suvari delegate got the communication from her home government on day 14. She read it twice. Then she went to find Vrethna. There was a medical database. The Suvari used it for 40 billion citizens across 9 worlds. Disease tracking, treatment protocols, pharmaceutical interaction records. It had been built collaboratively, with significant Terran involvement, 40 years ago. Since then, it had been updated continuously. Its error rate kept impressively low, its coverage expanding with each passing year. The woman responsible for the day-to-day maintenance was a human doctor named Priya Ose. She had taken the position 22 years ago, because according to the single personal note in her employment file, she found the scope of the problem interesting. She had not been a contractor. She had been a permanent staff member of the Suvari medical office, working remotely from her home, logging in every day, fixing problems nobody else had noticed were problems yet. Her access credentials had been tied to her Terran diplomatic identification. The diplomatic identification had been deactivated when the network went dark. She was locked out. The Suvari medical office had sent 3 messages to her personal address. No response. They did not have another contact for her. They had never needed another contact for her. She had always just been there when they logged in. The database was still running. For now. But it was like a garden that had lost its gardener still alive, still green, but with small wrong things beginning to grow in the corners that would get larger if nothing was done. The Suvari delegate told Vrethna all of this in a level voice. Vrethna listened. Made notes. What does it affect? Vrethna asked. The delegate looked at her for a moment. Everyone, she said. Eventually. On day 19, the peacekeeping fleet's threat assessment system flagged an active border dispute between the REL and the Suvari. Standard protocol called for the system to identify the appropriate response. Diplomatic intervention. Neutral peacekeeping deployment. Recommended mediators. The system processed the dispute parameters. Cross-referenced historical conflict data. Ran its analysis. Then it returned a single output line. Recommended mediator. Unavailable. The fleet commander read this. Read it again. Asked his systems officer what it meant. The systems officer dug into the code for an hour before surfacing with an answer that he delivered very carefully. The way you deliver news that you know is going to make someone else's day significantly worse. The conflict modeling software, the one that calculated de-escalation approaches, identified pressure points, suggested which specific individuals from neutral parties had the right background to mediate specific types of disputes, had a primary mediator database. The database was updated and maintained by the Council's human diplomatic staff. The update pathway was broken. The system knew it was working from outdated information. It knew the recommended mediators might not be available, might not be in the right place, might not exist in their previous roles anymore. So in perfect logical consistency, it had flagged the best option as unavailable and offered nothing else, because offering something it couldn't verify would have been a greater risk than offering nothing. It was, technically, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The REL-Suvari border situation had no mediator. The fleet commander sent the report to Vrethna. Vrethna looked at the audit sitting on her desk. Thessaly had printed it and brought it over that morning. 46 pages. And still growing, and felt something move through her that she chose not to examine closely. A Keth delegate named Horn, who was old enough to have a long memory and politically experienced enough to prefer a strong offense over an uncomfortable silence, stood up in the emergency session on day 21 and said what several others had been thinking. This is a negotiating position, he said. That is all this is. The humans want better terms. They want a larger seat, more formal recognition, higher weighting on their votes. Fine, we can give them that. Let us open formal negotiations and resolve this cleanly. Several delegates nodded. Thessaly Orn, in the back row, looked at her 46 pages of audit. and thought about the pattern she had found in the attendance logs. 10 years of gradual withdrawal, careful and quiet, like someone who had already made their decision a long time ago and was simply completing a process they had started. People who wanted better terms announced that they wanted better terms. They did not quietly let their navigation contracts lapse 8 months in advance. She didn't say this out loud. She was an aide. She took notes, but she kept the thought, folded it up, put it somewhere useful. That night she reached page 50 of the audit and stopped on an entry that sat there on the page, looking very ordinary and very devastating at the same time. The Council's standard translation software, used in every session, every document, every official communication between species who did not share a language, had been built and was being updated by a Terran linguistics team under a service agreement that had, she now confirmed, the same deactivation condition as everything else. It was still running. Like Dr. Osei's garden. Like the routing network before day 9. Running on existing parameters. Parameters built from data that stopped being updated 11 days ago. She sat for a moment doing nothing. Then she picked up her pen and wrote at the bottom of page 50, in small, careful letters. Check what the translation errors look like when they start. Will they be obvious? Or will everyone think they understand each other when they don't? She underlined it. She didn't sleep well. It was Thessaly who found it, which was probably fitting. She had been working through the General Archive, one of the less exciting parts of the audit, checking which filing systems had Terran maintenance behind them, when the search flag came back with something unexpected. A document, deposited 14 months ago, in the Council's standard diplomatic intake queue. Sender. Office of Terran Affairs. Council Division. Priority flag. Low. That was the first strange thing. Terran staff did not usually file documents with a low priority flag. They were, as a rule, precise about categorization. The second strange thing was the title, Observations on Council Culture and the Structural Marginalization of Terran Input. A decade review. Thessaly stared at it for a long moment. She checked when it had been received. 14 months ago. Confirmed. She checked whether it had been read. She found the response queue, the intake system that processed incoming diplomatic documents, and routed them to the appropriate senior staff member for review. The document had been sitting in the queue, unread, for 14 months. Above it in the queue were 43 other items that had been processed and cleared. She scrolled through them. 31 were procedural motions, budget line confirmations, formatting amendments to existing resolutions, minor housekeeping items. 24 of the 31 had been submitted by Terran staff. They had been doing council housework, while their own document sat beneath it, unread. Thessaly opened the file. It was 70 pages long, footnoted. Every claim supported by a reference, a date, a session record, written in plain language, the kind that was chosen because the writers wanted to be understood, not because they lacked the vocabulary for complexity. She started reading. She did not stop for 2 hours. The document was not a complaint in the way she had expected a complaint to look. It did not have the heat of something written in a bad moment. It had the weight of something that had been assembled over a long time by people who were keeping track. It began with a simple statement of purpose. The Terran delegation had been observing a pattern in council operations for approximately 10 years. They had documented it carefully. They were bringing it to the council's attention because they had committed, at the time of their original membership, to always provide the council with the opportunity to self-correct before any unilateral action. They were honoring that commitment. Then it laid out the pattern. Every formal risk assessment submitted by Terran delegates over the decade, there were 63 of them, was cross-referenced against outcomes. Of the 63, 49 had been tabled without discussion. The other 14 had been discussed briefly and then shelved, pending further review. The further review had never happened for any of them. Of the 49 tabled without discussion, 31 had subsequently become actual problems. Not theoretical problems. Real ones. Supply shortfalls. Diplomatic failures. Infrastructure breakdowns. 3 of them had become crises that the Council had spent significant resources managing. In none of the 3 after-action reports had the original Terran warning been mentioned. The document then moved to voting records, instances where human delegates had raised procedural concerns and been talked over, session transcripts where Terran motions had been reclassified as advisory rather than binding, without explanation. 14 years of documented patterns showing that when human delegates said something that required work or change or discomfort, it tended to be the thing that got filed at the bottom of the queue. It was not accusatory. It was simply factual, in the way that a very long and very accurate record is factual. The last section was the one that Thessaly read 3 times. It said, "The Terran delegation had reached a conclusion. Not with bitterness," the document said, and Thessaly believed it. Because bitter people do not write footnotes, but with clarity. The structure of the Council, as it currently existed, was one in which Terran effort produced Council benefit, while Terran concerns produced Council inconvenience. That was not a sustainable arrangement. The delegation had, over the past 14 months, been making alternative arrangements. Those arrangements would be complete within the month, following this document's filing. The document closed with a single paragraph that Thessaly read very slowly. "We are submitting this document because we said we would. We were told, when we joined, to believe in this institution's capacity for honest reflection. We have tried to hold on to that belief for a long time. We are not certain it was warranted, but we made a promise, and so here is the document. We do not expect a response. We hope we are wrong about what that says." That was it. No signature beyond the official office stamp. No farewell. No anger. Thessaly sat back in her chair. She looked at the timestamp. 14 months ago. Filed correctly. Tagged correctly. Sent to the right queue. Sitting under 31 procedural motions, most of which the humans had written themselves. She printed the document and walked it to Vretna's office. Vretna read it the same way Thessaly had quietly, without interrupting herself, to the end. When she finished, she set it on her desk and looked at the wall for a while. "When was this filed?" Vretna said. 14 months ago, Thessaly said. Vretna nodded slowly. Thessaly waited to be dismissed. She wasn't. "I sat next to a human delegate once," Vretna said. "In a session. She had concerns about the REL border monitoring. This was maybe 7 years ago, and she raised them during open comment. I remember thinking the timing was poor. We had a long agenda. I noted her comments and moved on." She paused. "I don't remember what the concerns were." Thessaly said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "Pull the session record," Vretna said. "Find the comment, then find the subsequent border incident reports, and see if there's a connection." Thessaly already knew there would be. She had seen the pattern in the document. She went and pulled the record anyway. The document moved through the senior staff that week. Carefully, quietly, without a formal distribution order, passed from desk to desk, the way difficult things sometimes move in institutions that are not ready to address them officially, but cannot entirely ignore them either. Reactions varied. Some delegates decided the document proved their original theory. The humans had been planning this for a long time. It was a strategy. They would be back once they had made their point. Some read it and grew very still, and did not say much for a day or two. The Keth senior delegate, Horn, read the first 20 pages, set it down, and said that the document was clearly a one-sided account and should be evaluated with appropriate skepticism. He was correct that it was one-sided. Everything he had subsequently confirmed about the routing network, the medical database, the translation software, and 11 other failing systems sat in Thessaly's audit on page after page of evidence that the one side it was on happened to be the accurate one. She did not point this out. She went back to page 51 of the audit and kept working. The document sat on desks and was not yet discussed in any official session. The Council was very good at finding things that required attention more urgently than the uncomfortable thing. But it had been read. That was something. Probably. Thessaly thought about the last line. "We hope we are wrong about what that says." She thought about the 43 items that had been processed above it. She added the archive intake system to the audit. Page 52. The Rel-Suvari border situation became a war on day 41. Not a large war, Not the kind that gets named. The kind that starts with a supply convoy crossing a contested checkpoint at the wrong time, with the wrong permissions, and a border officer who had been on shift for 14 hours and made a decision that he would spend the rest of his life replaying. Without the conflict modeling software running current data, the Council's response protocols were slow, not broken. The system still worked, still processed inputs, still generated recommendations. But it was working from a picture of the political situation that was 10 months out of date. The mediators it suggested were wrong. One had retired. One had been involved in a separate rel dispute and was compromised. The third was available, but lacked the specific knowledge of the current Suvari leadership structure that would have made the approach viable. The fleet deployed. The peacekeeping units arrived. They did the work they were trained to do. But there were moments, small decision points, hours-long windows, where the right word from the right person at the right time might have changed the direction of things, where the system's recommendations led to the wrong room, or the wrong tone, or the wrong concession. Offered first. By week 6, 3 REL border installations had been destroyed. 2 Suvari supply lines were cut. 400 people were dead. The number would eventually reach 1,200 before the ceasefire. On the supply side, the Keth routing failures had been partially patched by a team of Keth mathematicians working around the clock to reverse engineer the navigation logic from its own outputs. They were brilliant. They made real progress. The patch covered 60% of the affected corridors by week 4. The remaining 40% handled the supply lines to 3 agricultural worlds in the outer Keth territories. Worlds that depended on off-planet inputs for certain key nutrients that their soil did not produce. The delay was not long, 12 weeks before an alternative routing solution was functional. 12 weeks was not, in the scale of interstellar logistics, a catastrophic gap. But those 12 weeks overlapped with the harvest season, and the alternative routes were longer and more expensive. And by the time the math was right and the shipments were moving again, 2 of the 3 worlds had already begun rationing. Children ate less for 2 seasons. Not famine, not death. Just less, in the way that not enough quietly shapes things in small bodies over time. Nobody in the council chamber was hungry. It was easy for that to be a logistical problem instead of a human one. Easy. And wrong. But easy. Thessaly added it to the audit under a new column she was now keeping. Confirmed downstream harm. The Suvari medical database held longer than anyone expected. That was, in its own way, almost worse. It held because the existing parameters were very good. Because Priya Ose had done very good work for 22 years, and the system she maintained was robust. It didn't fail because she left. It just began to drift. Small errors at first. Treatment protocols not updated to reflect new interaction data. Disease tracking that missed a new variant because the classification codes hadn't been refreshed. Nothing individually critical. Cumulatively, the kind of degradation that a doctor would notice before a statistician would, because it showed up as hunches, first a treatment working slightly less often than it should, a reaction appearing slightly more often than expected. By week 8, the Suvari Medical Office was fielding a higher than normal number of physician-reported anomalies. By week 12, they were worried. They sent a formal request to the council for assistance in finding someone with the expertise to take over database maintenance. The request was processed. An advisory committee was formed. The committee held its first meeting on week 15 and spent most of it determining the correct scope of its mandate. The database continued to drift. Horn, the Keth senior delegate, had not changed his position. The humans would return. This was strategy. What was needed was patience and a better offer. He proposed a formal resolution. The council would officially recognize Terran contributions across a range of domains, offer an elevated voting weight on matters touching human interests, and extend a formal invitation to resume their seat. The resolution was drafted, amended, redrafted, amended again. The process took 3 weeks. When it was finally put to a vote, it passed with 38 in favor, 5 abstentions, and 3 delegates who were not present because they were managing the Rel Suvari ceasefire logistics. The resolution was transmitted to every last known Terran contact address. No response came. Not a refusal. Not a counter-proposal. Nothing. The same silence that had been there from day one, consistent and total, and somehow worse each time it was repeated. Horn told the chamber this simply meant the humans hadn't received the message. The relay infrastructure was still being assessed. They should try again. Vrethna did not argue with him. She looked at the voting record, the very long history of Terran motion sitting in the tabled column, and thought about the document in the archive, and thought about the phrase, times, other arrangements, times, and said, nothing. Thessaly, in the back row, looked at her notes. The thing about watching competent people fail is that it offers no satisfaction. The delegates worked hard. Session after session, 12 and 14 hours at a stretch. The peacekeeping commanders in the Rel Suvari theater were skilled. The Keth mathematicians solving the routing problem were genuinely impressive. The Suvari medical office staff were devoted to their patients and doing everything within their reach. None of them were lazy. None of them were indifferent. None of them had wanted this to happen. They were just people trying to fill a shape they hadn't known existed until the thing that filled it was gone. People reaching into a wall cavity and touching air where something solid used to be. Thessaly thought about this on the morning of day 58 while writing page 81 of the audit. She was adding the council's internal scheduling system, also human-built, also now running without update, already producing minor conflicts in session booking that were about to become major ones. And she realized she had stopped being surprised. That was the change. Early on, each new entry had felt like a revelation. Now they felt like inventory. This was the other cost, she thought. Not just the 1,200 dead in the border conflict. Not just the children eating less. Not just the database drifting. The cost of having believed, for 230 years, that the institution was the thing that worked. That the systems were the thing that ran. That the work was just happening, the way weather happens, without someone choosing to do it every day. The audit was 81 pages long. She had not reached infrastructure yet. Vrethna asked to see it on day 60. She paged through it slowly, at her desk, for a long time. When she got to the confirmed downstream harm column, she set the document down and looked at the ceiling. How many more sections? She said. At least 30. Thessaly said. Vrethna nodded. There will be a session tomorrow, she said. Horn wants to try the formal invitation again. Different wording. Thessaly said nothing. I know, Vrethna said. I know what you're thinking. I'm not thinking anything. Thessaly said carefully. Yes, you are. Vrethna handed the audit back. You're thinking that they're not coming back, and that we should probably start behaving accordingly. A pause. That's what I'm thinking too, she said. I just don't know what behaving accordingly looks like yet. Thessaly looked at the 81 pages in her hands. I think it looks like this, she said. Vrethna looked at the audit for another moment. Then keep going, she said. The ship arrived on day 179. No advance notice. No identification beacon beyond the standard civilian registration code. A small courier vessel, the kind used by trade intermediaries and private diplomatic messengers. It docked at the council's main station during the quiet morning hours, when the corridors had only maintenance staff and early shift administrators. By the time Vrethna was notified, the passenger had already cleared entry processing. One person, human, female by their standards, young, with dark hair, and the specific kind of expression that comes from having done a thing many times and no longer finding it remarkable. She was carrying a document case and a sealed metal thermos. She told the entry officer her name was not relevant. She gave a contact designation instead. Transition Coordinator. Independent Terran Network. She asked to speak with whoever was currently managing the dependency audit. The entry officer didn't know what a dependency audit was. Thessaly Orn did. The message reached her in 9 minutes. They met in a mid-level conference room, the kind used for working meetings rather than official sessions. No chamber, no formal seating arrangement. Thessaly arrived first. Vrethna came 6 minutes later. The transition coordinator was already seated. Her thermos was on the table. She did not offer anyone else a cup. She looked at the audit Thessaly had brought it. 112 pages now, bound properly at last, the way someone looks at a thing they already know the contents of. How far did you get? She said. Infrastructure. Thessaly said. We're through it now. The coordinator nodded. The routing network, she said. The medical database. The translation lag. Yes, Thessaly said. The border conflict. A pause. Yes, Vrethna said. The coordinator was quiet for a moment. Not as a power move. As someone who had expected this accounting and was giving it a moment to settle. We know about the border conflict, she said. We've been watching. That landed in the room. Vrethna set her hands flat on the table. You've been watching, she said. We watch most things that involve systems we built, the coordinator said. Monitoring doesn't require a seat at the table. She opened the document case, placed a single bound document on the table, slid it forward. Not thick. Perhaps 30 pages. Clean cover. No official seals. No council formatting. The kind of document produced by people who no longer needed the institution's approval of their formatting choices. What happened after we left, she said, is documented in your audit and in our own records. I'm not here to relitigate it. I'm here because we said, in the document we filed 14 months before our withdrawal, that we would give the council the opportunity to correct course. This is the second part of that. End quote. Vrethna and Thessaly both looked at the document. Neither reached for it yet. What is it? Vrethna asked. A service agreement, the coordinator said. Specific, priced, scoped. What we can fix, what it costs, and how long it takes. The routing problem is solvable in about 6 weeks with the right team. The medical database needs 3 months minimum and full system access, which we can work around if you want or just let us in if you don't. The conflict modeling software needs a complete data refresh and a new update protocol that doesn't rely on diplomatic staff continuity. She paused. That one we're recommending you let us build differently. We have a better architecture, Vrethna said, carefully. And what do you want in return? Payment, the coordinator said simply. Market rate for technical services. Not political favors. Not a seat. Not recognition. A silence. You're not coming back, Vrethna said. It was not quite a question. No, the coordinator said. What had happened in the 14 months of the council's missing presence, and then in the months of crisis that followed, was not what the council had assumed was happening. The coordinator explained it in plain terms, the way someone explains something they are not trying to make impressive. For 10 years, the Terran delegation had been building what the coordinator called simply the network. Not a competing institution, not a shadow council, something smaller in ambition and larger in practice, direct relationships with 43 species who had, for various reasons, been sitting at the margins of galactic politics for a long time. Smaller civilizations. Newer spacefaring cultures. Species that the Council had formally classified as pre-advisory members for decades, which was the institutional language for not yet useful enough to fully include. The humans had simply started talking to them, not recruiting them, not organizing them against anything, just talking, learning their systems, their histories, their specific problems, sending people with skills to places where those skills were needed, and learning in return. Building relationships the old-fashioned way, which was slowly and without a formal agenda. The network had no central seat, no chamber, no roll call. It operated the way practical things operate when the people building them are more interested in outcomes than appearances. 43 species, Thessaly said. When we withdrew, yes, the coordinator said. More now. Vrethna looked at the service agreement on the table. She did not reach for it yet. Why offer this at all? She said. You don't need us. You've made that clear. The coordinator picked up her thermos, took a drink, set it back down. We don't need the council, she said. That's correct. But there are 40 billion Suvari citizens whose medical database is drifting. There are children on 3 Keth worlds who've been short on food for 2 seasons. There are 1,200 people dead in a border conflict that a working mediation system might have shortened. She looked at Vrethna directly. We're not doing this for the council. We're doing it because the people on the other end of those failures aren't the ones who ignored our document. That sat in the room for a moment. So, the coordinator said, that's the offer. You don't have to take it. You can solve these problems yourselves. You have good people. It will take longer and cost more. But it's possible. She slid the document another half-inch forward on the table. An invitation, not a push. Or you can work with us, on these terms, and we fix what can be fixed. Vrethna picked up the document. She read it in the silence of the room, pages turning slowly. Thessaly watched the coordinator, who appeared entirely comfortable with waiting. She was looking out the window at the docking bay, where her small courier sat next to vessels 3 times its size, looking unremarkable. When Vrethna finished reading, she set the document down. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Not officially." The coordinator waited. "When you filed the document 14 months before the withdrawal, did you already know no one would read it?" The coordinator looked at her for a moment. "We knew what the queue looked like," she said. "We knew what the priority flags meant in practice. We knew what things looked like above us in the stack." She paused. "But we said we would file it. So we filed it." Vrethna nodded slowly. "I processed items above it," she said. The coordinator said nothing. "I don't remember which ones," Vrethna said. "I've tried to look them up. I remember the work, but not the specifics. They all felt important at the time." "They probably were," the coordinator said. "That's usually how it works." The meeting ended 40 minutes later. The service agreement went back to Council legal review standard process, unavoidable. But Vrethna had indicated verbally that the terms were acceptable and that formal execution would follow within the week. The coordinator would remain at the station until the first project team arrived. Thessaly walked her back to the docking bay. They talked about small things on the way. The station's layout. How long the docking procedures took. Normal conversation between 2 people, with nothing pressing to say. At the bay entrance, Thessaly stopped. "Can I ask you something?" she said. The coordinator stopped. "The 43 species," Thessaly said. "In the network. What do you actually do? Day to day." The coordinator considered this. "We show up," she said. "We do the work that needs doing. We learn what we don't know. We build things that last." She paused. "The same things we were doing here mostly. Just with people who notice." She went through the bay door. Thessaly stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward her office. She had told Vrethna the audit was finished at 112 pages. That was true in the sense that she had cataloged every Terran system and every confirmed downstream harm and every failure point. But she had started a second document that morning. She hadn't told anyone about it yet. She was calling it the observation log. Page 1 was a question she had written at 2 in the morning after reading the Terran document for the 4th time. What would the council look like if the people in it noticed the same things the humans noticed? What would have to change? Start with the intake queue. She sat down at her desk. She opened the document. She started on page 2. She had a feeling she would be doing this for a long time. She found, sitting there in the quiet of the morning with the whole long work in front of her, that she didn't mind at all.